This Week in Virology, the podcast about viruses, the kind that make you sick. From Microbe TV, this is TWiV, This Week in Virology, episode 1023, recorded on July 7th, 2023. Oh, how about that? 2323. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and you're listening to the podcast all about viruses. Joining me today from Ann Arbor, Michigan, Kathy Spindler.
Hi, everybody. Here, it's a very pleasant 79 Fahrenheit, which is 26 Celsius, mostly sunny.
Wow. It's 30 C here in New York City. We're a little warmer. So at least I didn't say 2023. If this were episode 2023 in the year 2023, that would be really something. But episode 2023 is not happening this year. That's for sure. Also joining us from Madison, New Jersey, Brianne Barker.
Hi, it's great to be here. It is 89 Fahrenheit outside. Not that in my office, but very hot outside. And I'm excited to be here.
We have a guest for you today. She is a writer for The Atlantic, and she is just outside of Boston, so we'll get to see what the weather is up there. Katherine Wu, welcome to TWiV.
Hello, wonderful to be here. And the weather is not so different than it is in Jersey. It's 90 degrees Fahrenheit, 32 degrees Celsius, hot, humid, and thoroughly disgusting.
Well, I love hot and humid weather, being of Mediterranean extraction, but not everybody likes it. That's for sure. Well, thanks for joining us. We have all mentioned you here on TWiV a number of times in the past few years, so we're interested to learn more about you. You know, Kathy, I'm looking through the notes. There's nothing to announce.
I know. ASV is in the history books.
It's in the can, and Amy has hired a technician.
All right.
So I don't have to advertise that unless she wants to, which could very well be. So we're ready to move right into science here. So I just want to tell you, Katie, I subscribed to The Atlantic just so I could read all of your articles in the past week.
Oh,
so you can tell your bosses that I gave them some business, right?
Yeah, I wish I worked on commission, but we appreciate it all the same.
So actually, I had I got the digital subscription, which you can't escape, I guess. But also, for no extra charge, you get the magazine, and I want to just carry it on the train and look like an old timer reading a print magazine, right? Nobody does that anymore. I thought that would be fun.
I have a question about the print version because I don't get that. And that is all the things that you hyperlink in your article. Do people reading the print version get that as footnotes or not at all? Or
Not at all. They are still linked in the online version, but as you can imagine, that would create, I think, a total mess of the footnotes. So,
yeah, I thought it would be cool to have both. And I actually also, I'm a sucker for Instagram. When an ad comes up, I buy it. So I got an ad for the New Yorker, which is another one of my favorite. And so I subscribe to that also in the print. And I'm having them both sent here to the incubator. So when people visit, they can read intelligent matter, right?
That's exciting. I'm only a subscriber to the digital for The Atlantic, so next time I come to the incubator, I'll have to look at the print version.
Yeah, it's no extra charge to do that, so might as well do that. All right, let's move on to you, Katie. Let's start by getting a little bit of your history. I want to go back as far as you remember. I know you're not going to remember when you were 2 years old, but you can tell us where you were born and educated and how you got to where you are today.
Sure. Well, I have it on good authority from my parents that I was born in Southern California in the Los Angeles area. And I spent all through high school there. And I guess the kind of amusing slightly embarrassing part of my origin story is that I grew up not really liking science at all. I thought it was really boring. All of my classes in science I could pass by just memorizing things. And that's genuinely what I thought science was, memorization, looking through the glossary, having an answer for every multiple choice question on every exam. So ironically, I sort of grew up wanting to be a writer, to the horror of my parents, who wanted me to be a doctor or an engineer. And so I went to college. I immediately declared English as my major. I went to Stanford. But I was surprised, and maybe kind of pleasantly surprised, that I really missed having numbers and data in my life. I didn't realize that, entering a major meant diving so fully into something and leaving so much else behind. So I took a few science classes, and it was really in college that I was able to figure out that science was so much about questions and storytelling and, figuring out different ambiguities. It overlapped with a lot of creative writing in ways that I hadn't expected. And so by my junior year, I had fully switched over to science. I had made the move into microbiology. And it was really through taking a couple classes through still one of my favorite mentors to this day, Stanley Falco, who was a big player in medical microbiology, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago. But I took some classes from him. Spent a lot of time just talking to him in his office about his career. He encouraged me to join a lab and see if I liked it. I did, and that's kind of how I stumbled into the academic path. From there, I went to grad school at Harvard, joined Eric Rubin's lab to study, ostensibly Mycobacterium tuberculosis, but really spent a lot of time studying its benign cousin, Mycobacterium sphygmatis. And that was my deep foray into academia that lasted a few years.
Who else do you remember from Stanford in your classes? I'm just curious because I know a bunch of people there.
I loved Stanford. I am one of those people who thoroughly enjoyed college after feeling kind of meh about a lot of schooling before that. The campus was beautiful. All the classes I took were great. I was a human biology major, which is still to this day one of their most popular majors, which meant they, kind of our core classes, they paraded a lot of really big names and a lot of human genetics and anthropology and psychology. And of course, molecular and cell biology in front of us was really, really fun. I took some great classes from some great parasitologists. Didn't actually take any virology in college.
No, they're not.
For some reason.
Not many. It's interesting because I almost went there, and if I had, you might have had me for virology. But that's one of the reasons I didn't go, because there was not a lot of virology there.
No, yeah, not even in any virology labs. And so the lab I worked in undergrad was a gut microbiome lab, and I really enjoyed that. I thought I'd be doing bacteria forever and ever and ever.
I have to say that there are two. After I decided not to go, a few years later, they hired Carla Kierkegaard and Peter Sarno. So they're virologists. They hired who's the CMV guy, Kathy, with the red hair.
It's Stanford.
At Stanford. He was there, and then he left to go to a company. Anyway, they hired him. So they did hire a few virologists. But Stan Falco was the chair of the department, and he met me a few times and tried to recruit me. And I remember once he's driving me from the airport, and he said, "That's my house over there, the one that's the color of puppy shit."
Yeah,
that was Stanley, right? He liked to be outspoken. He was a New Yorker. He's probably from Brooklyn, right?
Gosh, where was he from? He was definitely from somewhere in New York, but maybe the Bronx or Queens.
Yeah. Anyway, did you ever encounter Pat Brown?
No.
He of the fake meat, right? Impossible Burger or Beyond Burger, whatever it is. He started that company.
And microarrays.
Microarrays, of course, yes.
The PLOS journals.
Yes. Good other things too, but yes, at some point he decided to save the earth and emissions from animals. And now he's making beef and veal and chicken and so forth. But love to get him on sometime and tell his story. Anyways, so you went to Harvard grad school. And you what were you doing? What kind of Mycobacterium sphygmatis, right?
Yeah. The very, very non-lethal Mycobacterium sphygmatis. But my whole thesis project was about proteases, what is sort of driving cell division, what do bacteria have to sort of keep in protein homeostasis to manage successful cell divisions, especially when you're growing so slowly, like so many mycobacteria do.
I have mycobacteria on my mind today because I just got an email that Bill Jacobs is giving a talk in a couple of weeks, and he wanted to talk to me. So I may make a foray up to Columbia. It's on a Friday, so I have to make sure I'm back here for TWiV.
Yes. And so that was in micro when you were at Harvard?
Yes. Our graduate program was ostensibly biological and biomedical sciences, but I worked in the microbiology department. It was very...
As an alum of one of the sister programs, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
That was at the medical school, I presume, right?
It was at the medical school in Longwood, so I rarely spent any time on the Cambridge campus.
Right. And what did you do next?
Well, I guess this is where it gets kind of sort of weirder. I loved grad school. I loved Eric's lab. I loved bench work. I loved lab meetings. I'd actually entered grad school thinking maybe this is not for me. Maybe this is just kind of a, I don't know, a stop on the way to something a little different. But by, I think, my fourth year of grad school, I was thoroughly convinced that I was going to postdoc and try the whole tenure track thing. I applied to a bunch of different postdocs, and my now husband was, I guess he is still a doctor. And so we were trying to plan to figure out, some school where we could both get jobs and eventually get maybe faculty positions. But the summer before my final year of grad school, I ended up doing a AAAS mass media fellowship. So, AAAS, the same organization that publishes the science family of journals, runs this fellowship where they put scientists in training at different media outlets across the country. Smithsonian, where I ended up, National Geographic, the Washington Post, also a bunch of local papers like, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, San Diego Tribune. And I did that for 10 weeks the summer of 2018. I got to write just a bunch of science news articles for Smithsonian, and I loved it so much more than I thought I would. I loved it so much that I thought, maybe this is not fate. I don't necessarily believe in fate, but the timing was so good. I was about to defend. I figured, why not just try to do this full time and see what happens?
So you defended, and then instead of doing a postdoc, you started writing.
Yeah. Instead of doing a postdoc, I actually backed out of a postdoc that I had sort of kind of informally accepted, which was a very tortured decision. But I got a job in Boston at Nova, the PBS Science documentary series, doing science news articles for their website. And I was there for a little over a year, freelanced for a little bit after that, and then ended up at the Times and then the Atlantic after that.
And so all of these were done with you in Boston. You didn't have to move for any of this, right?
Right. So Nova was already based in Boston, so I did not have to move. When I got the job at the Times, the original plan was for me to move to New York, but I got that job in December of 2019, and something very large happened after that made it really difficult to move. So I never ended up moving to New York at all.
Yeah, I was thinking if you had, maybe you would have coffee with Carl Zimmer and stuff like that, right?
Well, so Carl actually lives just outside of New Haven, right, which is actually the one place I did move because my husband was in training at Yale. So, the one kind of, I even hesitate to call it a silver lining because the pandemic had so few of those. But the silver lining was that I didn't have to move to New York. I could move to New Haven to be with my husband and got to hang out with Carl at his house sometimes.
Oh, cool.
He has 3 cats, so That's important.
Yeah, he does come in now and then. I know because once he came to our studio here and I interviewed him and had to coordinate with him being in New York on one of those days. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and so now you've been at the Atlantic for since 2019-ish, is that right?
Since early 2021. I was at the Times for nearly a year. Oh. And then, it's been 2.5 years at the Atlantic so far.
So I guess you did some COVID coverage at the Times before you moved to Atlantic, right?
Yes, quite a bit. That was like 90% of what I did at the Times because I started there June of 2020 and things were absolutely bananas. The news was coming in at all hours, every second of the day, and the deadlines were not impossibly tight, but near impossibly tight.
Yeah, that's what Carl said. Yeah, same
So
thing.
how do you decide which stories you're going to work on? Both at the Times, was that something that was assigned? Now at the Atlantic, was that assigned, or do you choose?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the answer really differs a lot depending on whether I'm talking about the Times or the Atlantic, which makes some sense. The Times is explicitly a newspaper. One of the chief jobs at the Times is to break news, to be first, to, really be giving readers sort of short digests of what is happening right now. So a lot of the things that I was writing about was coming as a direct assignment from my editors, like, oh my God, we just saw this thing. Can you write it up? Do you think it's important? To start calling people right now kind of thing. Or I would see something, a tweet from a scientist back when Twitter was a little bit less insane. I would get a text from someone alerting me to something. News would break elsewhere and we would sort of scramble to verify it. It was a lot of rushing. And I think that sort of affected the proportion of my pieces that, I guess were coming from me as sort of original ideas versus everyone sort of coming together in a Slack channel and saying, wow, something is happening right now. Who is free to write it up as soon as humanly possible, effectively? That led to some assignments coming in at 10:30 p.m. at night, some assignments coming in at 5 in the morning, who's awake? And, I certainly did pitch some ideas. I was especially fascinated by writing about all things immunology. I did a lot of pieces on testing, especially rapid testing and the kind of rise and fall of that and the sort of cultural changes around that. But the things I covered really, I think, shifted as the discourse around the pandemic continued to change. And then, of course, in a big way, when I moved to the Atlantic, very different culture there.
Has that changed now? Is it less crazy, and are you more able to pitch your own ideas?
Yeah, it's been really interesting. I think at the Atlantic, even when I was hired explicitly to write about the pandemic because that was January of 2021. So still very much in the thick of it. I still spent, I'd say, the vast majority of my time in the first year and a half writing about COVID. Still a lot of immunology, but I sort of expanded my palette to do some viral evolution, a lot about variants, definitely a lot about vaccines. And then just, how people were reacting to the pandemic, why people were continuing to care or what happened if they didn't. Started writing a lot more about long COVID. And really the thing that changed significantly was, my editors wanted me to write about things that I was invested in. Of course, it mattered immensely, and it still mattered the most what readers were most interested in. But also, they cared what sort of mattered to me, what was sticking in my brain, what I was obsessed with. And we didn't have to be first to everything necessarily, but we wanted to provide fresh perspectives, forward-looking perspectives, things that help sort of define the moment, not predicting the future in any sense, but giving people a sense of, well, here's what people are talking about right now. Why is that? Why does this feel so important? Why are people so stuck on this one question? Why are people so stuck on this one piece of misinformation? So on and so forth.
So there are 10 issues a year, and do you have something to write for every one of them? And are there things that get posted, for instance, online in between? How does that scheduling work?
Yeah, so I actually don't really write for the magazine. I think especially with newsier items, as you can imagine, publishing for the print magazine is something that unfolds over months, if not years. And so I pretty much write exclusively for the web. The web has a lot more articles than end up in the print magazine. Newsier things happen there. There are still many days where something happens and we write something and it goes up the same day. Which is just not going to fit with a print magazine's publication cycle. So we're, I think, on our desk, which is science, technology, and health, I think we're publishing as a group 3 to 4 pieces a day. So a lot. And they really range in length, 800 words to thousands of words. But the flip side is everything that is in the print magazine does end up online.
I don't want my print magazine anymore if you don't write for it. I mean, I got it to read your stories on the train. What am I going to do now? I guess there's other good stuff though, right?
Oh, there's so much good stuff. I actually, so my terrible dark secret is I actually don't get the print magazine either, just mostly because a few years ago I swore off getting print magazines because it's like you subscribe to one, you subscribe to 800 and suddenly they're all on your coffee table, just, guilting you.
It works really well, Vincent, if you read it on your iPad.
Yeah.
I totally agree with Katie that I had too many magazines, and I got rid of them all, really. But, I wanted to subscribe to Atlantic for this podcast, and the offer is no extra charge for the print, right? So I thought I would love to sit on the train and show people that you can still read something, because very few people do. And I realize it's not good for the trees and so forth. So after a year, I'll cancel the print magazine. But I just wanted to try it, right?
I mean, I still personally prefer reading things in a physical form. Like when I read fiction, when I read for pleasure, I am always borrowing a book from the library or buying a paperback online. It's what I grew up doing. It's nice to turn a page.
But this whole, if the internet hadn't happened, boy, publishing would be so different, right? I mean, you would be writing for print magazines and not writing 3 articles a day for sure.
No, definitely not. And I mean, the Times still obviously manages a daily newspaper. And, a lot of the pieces that I wrote for the Times, were in the paper the next morning, which was kind of mind-boggling to see. But even by then, it's out of date. It's kind of wild how the internet has changed what is breaking news and what is old news. The standards for that are just absolutely, like, it goes down to the second. Like if the Post publishes something 4 seconds before the Times, they beat them. They broke news.
Oh my gosh, 4 seconds. Well, I mean, it's changed all kinds of activities. It's changed education. You can do podcasts, you can print online, but and not always for the better, right? Because this idea that you need more clicks makes some sites just publish every 10 minutes, and you can't have good stuff every 10 minutes.
Yeah, I'd say that's true. There is this fine balance between quality and quantity, always, always, always. And, speed is a big trade-off there. I think, the Times and many other newspapers are extremely good at publishing really good, accurate stories very quickly. But I think there is a limit. You go a little too fast, you make more mistakes. You go a little too fast, and it's going to be exactly the same piece that someone else writes on the same deadline, just because there's not enough time to build a deeper, richer story with more context. But unfortunately, that matches with the reader attention span. So many people out there aren't even clicking the full piece. They read the headlines, they read the tweet, and they move on.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And Carl Zimmer was complaining about that. He said, we don't have a lot of time to check things, but also people don't read the whole article, and it's really too bad. But the same thing goes for science journal articles. I think people read the headline and then they go look at the tweet summaries. Somebody summarizes it and they don't read the paper, which everything is changing. But
it even happens with emails. People read the subject line and the first line of the email, and they don't get to the bottom where there's important stuff.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
So how do you actually figure out what part of that content and that complexity and that depth to get, or who to talk to help you get the story?
Good question. I mean, there's not going to be one single answer, certainly, for every piece that I do. But I think what is nice is once I've written about a topic over and over and over again, whether it's like COVID or, I don't know, polio vaccines is something that I've done a couple times. Like those are sort of different levels of, I wouldn't even call it expertise because I'm not necessarily an expert in both, but my level of comfort just grows with every additional piece I write on a subject. I start just getting more comfortable, being able to almost predict what people are going to tell me. I always want to confirm it, but a few strategies that I use, I always try to talk to a lot of people for every piece. I never end up quoting everyone I speak to just because there's not always room, but I call, I think, as many people as it takes. When I start to be able to anticipate what people are going to tell me, when their answers start to get very similar, I feel comfortable that I have reported enough that I have a good grip on the subject. I read papers just to sort of verify the facts. We also do have official fact checking at The Atlantic, so I'm constantly annotating my pieces. Like, here is a statistic, I pulled it from this paper, we're going to hyperlink to it, but also here it is for the fact checker so that they can click on it and get a sense of, like, is this up to date? Is this stat from 2002 or is it from 2022? We definitely want it to be the latter if it's available. And then I think in terms of just building a piece, what I put in, what I leave out, that's always tricky. I think before I start drafting a piece, even before I start reporting a piece, I try and get a general sense of, this is what I think the story is. You know, for instance, COVID immunology is like a topic, but for it to be a story, it has to have almost a thesis, a punchline, a through line that gives it an arc, a beginning, middle, and end. Like, I don't know, something about how difficult it is to do strain or variant selection for this fall's vaccine. That's more of a story that is going to fall within the general category of COVID vaccinology or COVID immunology. And once I have that sense, you know, there are probably related items that could be really interesting, like, you know, the precise machinations of how the virus is evolving, which is definitely going to deserve a mention in a piece like that. But it would probably be outside the scope of the piece to go into depth about, like, every variant and subvariant iteration and every single sort of immunological pressure on the virus that is causing it, or, you know, prompting it to evolve in response to that, for instance.
So you mentioned talking to people and getting a sense for what might be correct by, you know, how many people are saying it. But sometimes it's the minority that ends up being right? And so I think of everyone initially said, oh, Omicron is mild. And you actually wrote an article about that, which basically questioned it. Is that really the case? And now it turns out that it's not. A study was just published, which says it's just as virulent as the original. It's just the immunity that makes a difference. So, I mean, that must be hard. If you have 20 people saying the same thing and then there's one outlier, what can you do?
Yeah. And that is sometimes the case. I think in situations like those, you know, I can't always know. I am definitely I'm attempting to play the observer and trying to be as objective as I can. But I do try and pay attention to whatever discourse is happening online or in whatever back channels I can sort of sneak my way into. If I have a sense that there is disagreement, I mean, absolutely, the dominant narrative, especially in the media and I think in the public, was that Omicron was mild and trivial, nothing to worry about. Like, oh, the virus has evolved to be, like, completely benign. This is a common cold now. Everyone was saying that, but it depended, you know, how you defined everyone. I don't always necessarily trust the dominant thing that's in the media, especially if it is something that is going to be, like, harmful for a particular group. It didn't fit with my understanding of, you know, SARS-CoV-2's evolution up until that point. I knew there was this dimension of immunity that, you know, was not really being appreciated in that whole discourse. And I was talking to, yes, it was maybe a minority of people that I was hearing from, but there were several scientists on my radar already pushing back against that narrative. I can think of several who were tweeting about it or even just texting me about it at odd hours, expressing their frustration. And so it really helps when I have trusted sources that I go back to over and over. Sometimes I would, especially at the height of the pandemic, I'd check in with them and say, hey, what are people talking about right now? What are people disagreeing about right now? Like, what is frustrating you? Or are you seeing something in the media, in other outlets that you feel needs more nuance? Can I add something to this conversation? Doesn't always turn into a story, but in that case, it was a really fruitful one.
Yeah, I think if you have no time, if you have to crank out 3 stories an hour, then you hear 5 people say the same thing, and that's what you go with. I'm not saying you, but, you know, other writers, and that's problematic because obviously you need more time to figure out if the minority is actually got something, right?
Yeah.
So how does it work when it could become difficult to play the observer? Like, what if, for example, you suddenly had to write an article about Mycobacterium smegmatis, where you might have,
Yeah.
a lot of your own opinions on things? How do you sort of deal with that related to what you're hearing from others?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, actually, and I think it's a big kind of lingering question in the whole world of journalism. Certainly not just science journalism, which is a lot of times the task at hand is to be as objective as possible, but there's no journalist, not even any scientist, that is going to be 100% objective 100% of the time. You develop biases, you develop passions, you get really excited about certain things, and I think especially with journalism. You develop relationships with people that would make you feel terrible if you had to write anything potentially negative about them. So I I wouldn't rule it out. I doubt that I would ever have to write about Mycobacterium smegmatis. But if it did come up, I might say, actually, I think this piece is better suited for someone else to write about. I'm too close. And I might say the same thing about tuberculosis, depending on what the exact issue at hand was. If it was a piece that centered on, for instance, my grad school advisor, I would 100% recuse myself from that. It's not appropriate for me to do that. That is someone who became, a very close mentor to me, is still, a dear part of my life, practically family for me. I would not be able to write objectively about him or anyone else in my lab. Probably the same thing goes for a lot of other mentors I had in the department. That said, for instance, Harvard, even the Harvard School of Public Health, is a very big place. I don't have a necessarily personal relationship with the majority of people there. Very comfortable interviewing someone from that institution. But I draw a hard line if I know that I would not be able to write about someone negatively. It's a good litmus test. Not saying that every time I write about someone, I would write something negative about them. But if I'm not able to, it shows me that I would not be able to do my journalistic due diligence. That said, there are topics that I think I have a personal relationship with that I can fully acknowledge in certain pieces. So, for instance, if there's some amazing pieces on The Atlantic and other places where writers have come forward and said, I have long COVID, but I'm including myself in the piece, but I'm also going to interview a bunch of other experts to give me perspective. But at some point in the piece, I will sort of reveal the fact that I have long COVID. Maybe that was what gave me a vested interest in this topic. I think as long as the journalist is sort of disclosing what either could be a conflict of interest or just a perspective that would affect the way that they reported on something, the sorts of questions that they asked, the sort of main thrust of the piece. They just want to have an open, almost dialogue with the reader to the extent that they can.
So can you give us some insight as to how you actually do your writing and, how you get going, how you incorporate all the interviews that you've made? And you must have this big stack of something. It's not going to be paper, I guess, but it'll be bits. And how do you get it together and start writing?
It's really daunting. I think, it's not unlike having a giant pile of data and a lot of it is negative data and starting to think, oh God, I have to put together a manuscript and submit it to a journal somewhere. Really just getting started, figuring out like what's figure one, what's figure two, what's going to go in the supplement. All of that is a question of structure and scope. What belongs in the story? What belongs at the forefront of the story? And what order does it go? So those are actually parallels that I think a lot about. Obviously, science writing for a scientific journal is going to be incredibly different than what ends up in The Atlantic or The Times or anywhere else, really. But it's not so dissimilar that I haven't taken some lessons from that. I think generally at the beginning of a process, I have a decent sense of what a story is going to be about. That can always change drastically depending on what people tell me. So sometimes people will ask me even before I interview them, like, so what's the angle of the story? And sometimes I'm like, I don't know. It depends what you tell me. But generally speaking, I end up with a ton of interviews. I ask a lot of the same questions, but I also try and tailor questions to each individual person's expertise and what they want to talk most about. Once I have all these interviews, I will sort of start to outline I'll think back on all the conversations I had. I'll jot down notes on what jumped out at me. Whether it was like something funny someone said that would just add color to a piece, a personal anecdote that maybe a patient told me that really illustrates the emotional contours of a disease, or just something that surprised me. Sometimes the things that surprise me are the most interesting things for me to write about, because it gets me started on a bunch of other questions that I would have never otherwise addressed. Once I have a good sense of what has jumped out at me, I try and put them in a logical order. How can I open this piece? How can I, grab the reader, with something creative, something interesting, something that will make them keep reading? Do I have a strong selling point for the piece? Something that will, help generate a headline, help generate the sort of thesis of the piece. And then oftentimes at that point, I start to work backward. If I want the reader to come away with, say, these 3 takeaways about the effectiveness of vaccines, or, whether or not vaccines can or cannot block transmission or block infection, if I want them to have certain takeaways, can I work backward and get a sense for, if they need to know this, what is the bare minimum amount of information for them to understand that point with enough clarity and, as few distractions as possible that they can get to that point. Most everything else can go, especially if I'm giving the reader new information, if I'm sort of challenging them to sort of learn as they go along the piece. I don't want to overload them with information. I don't want to inundate them, and I don't want to give them too many tangents that might distract them from coming away with those main points.
Do you ever write something and then throw it out, but it was good for you to write that to get understanding?
100%. I think on average, if I'm writing, say, a 1,500 word piece, my first draft will be somewhere in the range of like 2,500. And then I cut it down before I send it to my editor. And inevitably, I'm a chronic overwriter, so the editor will end up cutting even more. But yeah, sometimes I will write 400 words and it's much better said as 120. And that is just, I lose some detail, but I gain a lot of clarity, I think.
I'm wondering if how far into the English major you got in terms of writing training, and if you ever had anything that would be anything like real journalism training, or if you just came by it naturally.
Yeah, so really, I think the last time I had formal training in journalism, and I wonder if I can even call it formal, I did my high school newspaper, but I chose not to do that in college because I was more interested in creative writing. I thought for a while I might be a fiction writer, or just, a nonfiction writer, a memoirist or something even. But I was in the English major for about a year and a half. I declared a human biology major somewhere midway through my sophomore year, and then by the end of junior year, I had subspecialized into microbiology and infectious disease. But I kept taking English courses, and I actually did a creative writing minor alongside my human biology major because it was something that I was really passionate about. I just had no idea I could possibly blend the two until grad school, frankly.
Cool.
What do you think was the hardest part about covering the pandemic?
Oh gosh, I mean, this is still something that is difficult because I'd say I realize you asked this question before and I didn't fully answer it. But, when I first joined The Atlantic, I'd say still 90% of what I was writing was COVID related. Now, gosh, it's maybe 20, 25%, but I'm committed to continuing to cover infectious disease. I think so much of it has been getting people to care, getting people to read. There were spikes in interest that almost perfectly tracked the spikes in hospitalizations throughout the pandemic. That's, of course, when people were most interested. But they were interested in very specific things. They were interested in, like, is this vaccine working? Like, how likely is it that I'm going to catch this particular variant? Like, how harmful is this variant? Very sort of personal health focused questions. 100% understandable. But getting people to care about, I think, like the machinations of viral evolution, getting them to care about like specific things in epidemiology, even writing pieces that were maybe a little bit of a gloomier perspective, like, actually, no, this virus has not magically evolved to be completely mild. No, this is not a common cold yet. Sometimes people were not very happy clicking on those pieces. And so I think getting people to stay engaged, getting people to remain invested in ways that would maybe affect their perspective on the pandemic and affect their daily actions, whether or not to mask even, that sort of thing, it was tough. And, certainly my fellow writers and I got a lot of emotional reactions from readers when we weren't always writing what they wanted us to write.
Does the Atlantic provide you with metrics to see how each of your articles is doing?
They do. So there's a way to sort of log into a site to get a sense of, how many clicks did this article get? When did those clicks come? And also, how long are people spending on the page? It gives you a good sense of, are they just looking at the headline? Are they reading the first few lines and stopping? Or is there a high likelihood that they spent enough time on the page that they actually reached the end of the piece? But I'll be totally honest with you. I don't spend a lot of time looking at those numbers because they kind of give me hives. The scariest part of being a writer for me is just how public this all is. That was such a big change from being a bench scientist where like,
Sure.
oh no, I spilled my mini prep. No one's going to notice. But like, you mess up here and it's very public. It's a lot. So I actually like, if I get reader email that says, thank you, I really enjoyed this, or, this really helped me understand X, Y, or Z. That's the feedback I value most rather than the number of clicks or the number of Twitter likes or reshares or anything like that.
Well,
Do
if
you
you
have-
go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, do you have any part in the headline writing, or is that someone else?
Yes and no. I think, you've probably all heard and maybe even tweeted about the fact that like a lot of writers don't end up writing their final headlines.
Sure.
I think that's generally true across most outlets. At The Atlantic, we kind of workshop headlines with each other. Everyone actually jumps in and suggests different things, but generally, like once it goes up, The Atlantic does headline testing, which you may have heard of. A piece will appear in different places with different iterations of the headline, and usually it's like the most popular one that wins, and that I don't have a say in. It's kind of like which is the most clickable, which looks the most appealing. So it's kind of a medium space. I think headline writing it's one of the curses of journalism. I've always hated it. I've always felt very, very, very stressed about it because you can never encapsulate a single piece of any length in 10 words maximum, 65 characters. It's impossible. It's terrifying. And sometimes editors, I think especially at some other publications I've worked at, do swoop in with a headline that doesn't fully capture the main idea of the piece. And that can get a little contentious or stressful.
Well, you can certainly get more clicks by making a certain kind of headline, right? And maybe the headline doesn't even reflect the conclusion of the article, but one small aspect of it. And that's often not fair. I tell my virology class every year, if any of you are going to be headline writers, please do not ever write a headline that says the virus is mutating, because that's like saying the earth is flat. And they laugh like crazy because I don't know if headline writers go to college or not, but boy, sometimes they're just not right. And if you complain to the author, as you said, they say, we didn't write it. So there's not much you can do about it. But Katie, if you listen to all the TWiV, you know that many of your articles have resonated with us over the past few years, where it seemed that many people were missing the mark. We often said, "Hey, look at her article this week. It's saying exactly what we're saying." And in fact, you covered some things that we talked about. And the one that comes to mind is the tattoo article that you wrote on another podcast of ours, Cindy Leifer on Immune, talked about that very briefly as well. So we appreciate your writing and your perspective. And I think probably being a scientist in the field has something to do with it.
Yeah, I like to think so. I mean, and I actually will say I had heard vaguely about that macrophage tattoo paper when it came out, but it was actually Immune that reminded me of its existence.
Yeah,
and so
cool.
when I saw that there had been follow-up work on it, that's part of what inspired me to write that piece. And the other great thing about listening to Immune and TWiV is, I've used both Cindy and Brienne as sources in my pieces. I don't think I would have heard of them if not for these podcasts. But yeah, I mean, I do like to think that having a background, having a PhD has enhanced my work. I think the flip side of that is there are things I've actually had to actively unlearn in transitioning from science to journalism. And I certainly don't have the, I think, in-depth training in journalism that a lot of my colleagues have that make them incredible journalists in ways that I'm not, so it's a big trade-off. I don't think I am a superior journalist. I'm just a very different kind of science journalist. But yeah, the things I've had to unlearn, I think when I started science writing, I was very much of the mind that like, oh, my main job is to get people excited about science. Like science is this great thing that like we should all be on board with and should feel connected with. And I do still feel that way to some extent. But back to the idea of being an objective observer, part of my job is also to hold science and scientists to account. Scientists are humans. Sometimes they make mistakes. There are people with scientific backgrounds that sometimes act in bad faith. And sometimes it is my job to call that out, even if it does sometimes make people wonder, like, should I be trusting scientists? And of course, the answer is like, you should certainly trust the majority of science that's coming out, but there's going to be bad data some places. There's going to be data that's manipulated. There's going to be data that is purposely misconstrued. And, here are some of the ways to look at the whole institution that gives you a sense of like what is going right and what is going wrong. I think another thing that I think about often is, my first drafts always have to be edited. They always have to change. They always have to improve in the hands of my editor. And I think I still lean toward being overly detailed. I'm always very stressed about like, well, what if we didn't put in these like 16 other caveats? A lot of times they do belong in a piece, but other times they can be a distraction. If it's something that I need to bring up and then immediately dismiss in the next sentence, maybe both sentences can just go. Again, if the goal is to get the reader to take away some big picture points, sometimes if you over inundate them with the caveats to begin with, they might be so distracted or led down a different path that they may not take away the main points. And so I sometimes have to let the little things go, which is tough because I want to put in like panel J in figure 6, but I can't always.
So I presume your editors are not scientists, right? They're looking at the writing.
They're looking at the writing, but I mean, they're also like trained science journalists. Actually, a couple of them have either like masters in like a scientific field. I think one of them spent a couple years doing a neuroscience grad program. But I mean, they are incredibly good at reading papers. They have really sharp eyes for like, is the data really saying this? So it's not just the writing. They are also looking for logical consistencies and inconsistencies, which I really appreciate. And our fact checkers are definitely very good at that kind of thing as well.
You mentioned that you feel like there are some of the pieces of journalism training that you're missing that some of your other colleagues might have. I'm kind of curious, what kind of skills or pieces do you feel like those might be? Maybe this is just me being like, but I really like your articles.
Well, no, I mean, I guess, it's impossible for me to give a complete answer to that because I don't know what I still don't know. But I think some of the things that I had to just learn by doing or making mistakes or watching other people do it, like it wasn't intuitive to me, for instance, when I first started this, that like, for instance, I shouldn't interview people that I'm close to. Like if I stumbled across a topic that I knew really well because I was, close with someone in grad school who had studied this, my first instinct might have been like, oh, I know who to call for this. Like we can talk for hours about this and they already know who I am. They'll pick up my phone call. But no, I realized it was a conflict of interest. That was something that I sort of had to be taught and have a conversation about. And how close is too close? How far is just far enough? There's no, bright line threshold for that, but something that I've sort of had to navigate as I go along. Things like, you're never supposed to let sources read drafts before they go to publication, just how to navigate things like, the fact checking process when people disagree with each other, all sorts of sort of minute, almost socio-political conflicts that happen within the world of journalism that aren't as intuitive. And even just like what is typical and what is not typical in an interview, which I think is something that is tricky sometimes when you're interviewing a science source that doesn't have a lot of media experience. I don't know about any of you, but I got absolutely zero media training when I was in grad school. And not that I suffered for it, but it certainly left me not super well prepared to be tackling things from the other side. And it's still, to this day, I get a lot of questions from sources that I think could be preempted by a little bit of media training in different academic institutions.
Yeah, we didn't, but I think it's a good thing to have. It can help you respond in certain ways that you might not otherwise. So I would always recommend it. One of the hot points in the pandemic, and which you've written about, This is one of the articles we really got excited about. It's called "Vaccines Are Still Mostly Blocking Severe Disease." This is a time when, we had just vaccinated a lot of people. We were a few months in, and, the vaccines were doing a good job at preventing just about everything, including infection. And then, of course, the antibody and T cell levels declined, and infections started, and the press freaked out. They said the vaccines failed, and you respond with an article like this, and you question in the article. You write, back when it's not necessarily the first protective pinnacle the world sets its sight on, which is protecting against disease and death. Back when the vaccines were new and a near perfect match for the circulating strain, many people felt hopeful that we'd quickly clamber up some symptom-free vista in capital letters, which I think is cool. Maybe even dart up to no infection point, also in capital letters. Why was this high bar set at all, Katie? Because that's not how most vaccines work. Were people just not familiar with that?
I don't think that they were. And, this is always one of those tricky things. I always hesitate a little bit to speculate on what were people's motivations? What were people thinking? But I do remember so much about that. And I think a lot of it does trace back to, I think people set their expectations really low the first year of the pandemic. When Moderna and Pfizer were conducting their preliminary trials, everyone was like, oh God, I hope these vaccines are ready by 2022, and who knows when they will be ready, and when they work, how well will they work? But then, gosh, was it November of that year when both Pfizer and Moderna started publishing their first round of early results? Everyone was like, oh my God, 94.5% effective, 95% effective, and people aren't getting infected. But of course, what was not fully addressed at the time was, look at the time points at which they are collecting this data. It's just weeks out from people getting their shot, maybe a couple months. It is going to look different down the line. And I think people were so unaccustomed to thinking about clinical trials, thinking about how antibodies work. A lot of people had never even heard the word antibody. It was such good news at the time that people got stuck on that single freeze frame rather than thinking about, well, how does this typically play out over months and years? It's like people got, a snapshot of a movie trailer from the first 10 minutes of the film and totally forgot, oh, there's actually 97 minutes of this movie left that we have not even had time to address. And so when that started playing out in the real world, it was people's first experience of it. It was their first time even reading about, breakthrough infections, a word I still don't like, in the news. And it really got complicated. People felt like they got duped because they saw those headlines. And I think the assumption was, even if it wasn't explicitly said in the piece, this is going to be forever.
People have not really experienced a big vaccine trial like this one.
Yeah.
This generation has not. I think the last one would have been the polio vaccine trial, right? Nothing as big has happened, and so no one's used to it. And back then, they looked for paralysis or not. That was it. We didn't have ways to look at infection. And so back then, the vaccines prevent paralysis. Let's license them. So I tell people, you should read some history sometime. Old papers are good.
Right. Yeah, no, it's really interesting. This is one of those topics. This has been one of my favorite topics, actually, throughout the pandemic. This whole discussion of sterilizing immunity. Is that even a thing? How good are some of our best vaccines, like polio, MMR? We were never looking for infection. We didn't have the technology, and it didn't matter that much. It was enough to eliminate those infections from a bunch of different countries. You didn't have to fuss about whether there's, 2 or 3 viral particles bopping around in someone's nose.
So that I'm glad you bring up that term, sterilizing immunity. Often the papillomavirus vaccines are quoted as being sterilizing, but in fact, what they do is prevent cervical cancer 100%, right? So they're really good. And so people assume that it's sterilizing, but in fact, we don't look. We don't do PCR. We don't try and find if there's virus. And so unless you do that, you can't define sterilizing immunity. You can't do it on disease alone.
Right. And that one's a particularly interesting example to me because, I haven't reread up on this in a while, but, the way that vaccine works is actually really, really interesting. I mean, if there is anything close to sterilizing, that is certainly it. The antibody levels stay insanely high for a very, very, very long time. Somewhere, those long-lived plasma cells are just they just keep going. But when they do PCRs, I think they have actually done this in a few trials. They aren't really detecting virus, but then you start to ask, like, what is the threshold of detection? Are they surveying the correct sites? Sterilizing immunity is actually incredibly difficult to prove, because how do
Yes.
you prove the absence of something? Is it just that you're knocking up against the limits of your technology? And so, when I was writing about sterilizing immunity as a concept for the first time, I knew I had to call some people who were working on HPV vaccines. And even they were like, oh, no, we don't know if it's sterilizing. We just know that it's powerfully effective. And so, like, if it's clinically effective to the point where it can be assumed that it's sterilizing, that's really interesting. But it's a difficult philosophical line to walk. You don't want to guarantee that it's going to stave off all infections permanently.
And what happens, Katie, is that, well, I call them pundits. There are certain people who are very vocal and get interviewed all the time, and they hear sterilizing immunity, and then they propagate it. They repeat it without even looking at the data as you have, right? And then everyone all of a sudden is saying things that are not correct. And that's really bothered me about this. There are a few of them who are very vocal and very visible, and they look at the title of the article, and that's it. It's highly unfortunate.
Something else that I saw in your bio is that you've been involved with Story Collider, and I'm not really very familiar with what that does, and maybe you could tell us a little about that.
Yeah, I'd love to. So Story Collider is very, very different from my day job. It is a science storytelling series. So if any of you have ever listened to The Moth or Risk or Stories from the Stage, there are these events where people gather in like a bar or a pub, and they do live storytelling, just them and a microphone, true personal stories. Where Story Collider sort of fits into that whole big picture is it is still live, true personal stories, but with a science twist. So we've had like scientists talk about how they got started in their field. We've also had a lot of non-scientists talk about how science intersects with their lives. And the way I like to describe it is sometimes the science is a major player in the story, and sometimes it just makes a really quick cameo. I remember we've had stories where like someone used the scientific method to figure out who was stealing the milk out of their fridge. That's still totally a science story, but it's not a science story you would assume is coming from like someone who has spent their entire life in academia. But I'm a producer for those series. We have a series here in Boston. There's a bunch of places in New York that host Story Collider shows. So if you're ever interested, it's not too far. Nothing in Michigan yet so far, but Brienne and Vincent can check out some live shows. And we have a podcast that comes out every week on Friday, which is, of course, free. But it's something that I've really loved doing. I consider it very separate from my work at The Atlantic, but I think it helps me humanize science stories. It helps me ask questions that just add dimension. And it's always reminding me to not only feature the science and the data in my work, but the people who are doing it.
Cool.
One of the hot topics these days, I'm sure you know, we have a potential presidential candidate who is apparently against all vaccines. That's RFK Jr. He's been on a couple of very prominent podcasts, essentially spewing complete nonsense. For example, he said the 1918 pandemic was started by the vaccine, which, I mean, someone needs to fact check him, right? Because there weren't even flu vaccines or even influenza isolates at the time. But I'm wondering what your thoughts are and how scientists can counter that. Next week on TWiV, we intend to go through a lot of his claims point by point, but what else can be done?
Oh gosh, that is a big question, and I certainly won't pretend to have all of the answers. But yeah, I think it is really troubling. It's one more data point in this very long timeline of science becoming increasingly politicized. And I think, in a perfect world, everyone would be able to look at the data and say, oh, great, like I see this data. I know exactly what's happening. I have a good sense of what is, true information and what is misinformation, problem solved. But unfortunately, there's this idea in science communication, that idea is kind of like the deficit model, right? It's not just a matter of inundating people with information. If we were in that position and just giving people more data, giving people more material, if that were enough to solve the problem, we probably could have done more about it years ago, decades ago.
Mm.
I think now it's kind of like everyone existing in the world today is interacting with data with a pre-existing set of beliefs that acts as like a filter. They're going to be more likely to pay attention to certain streams of data. They're going to be more likely to pay attention to certain narratives and completely ignore others that don't fit with their pre-existing beliefs. And I think enacting cultural change is so much more difficult than introducing information onto a bunch of blank slates. And I think that's where we are right now. RFK Jr. already has a loyal fan base. There are a lot of people in this country who have not had any proper science education and aren't really set up to receive that data, even if they were open-minded to it. I wish there were a quick fix for this, but I think I appreciate anytime a science or journalist does try and get the correct information out there, tries to address the misinformation, which is always really tricky because you always want to address and correct misinformation without accidentally amplifying the misinformation. And unfortunately, misinformation tends to be easier to remember than the actual nuanced truth. And also, if I don't know, if I were queen for a day, I feel like I would go straight to the source, improve science education in this country. Like even I, as someone who science is a huge part of my job now, I didn't even like science until I was 18, 19, because I didn't have an understanding of what it was. I thought it was memorization. I thought it was boring. I thought we had figured out a bunch of things. And really the reason I love science now is for the things that we haven't figured out and the really interesting conversations that can happen. I wasn't introduced to that idea until college. And I think that is a huge shame. I'm sure some of that is on me, but some of that is also just on how we regard science in this country. It's so not the way that we need to be teaching, things as a matter of fact. It's so much about dialogue. And I wish that happened earlier for kids.
Unfortunately, that fixing of science, which I totally agree, is going to take a long time. And we have an immediate problem, which is that someone who spreads misinformation gets a lot more attention than the truth. And, we do our best, but we don't get millions of views. And, he does on his podcast. So it's rather frustrating. We don't give up, but I think it's very easy for, as you say, for people to believe someone who is prominent and has a very popular podcast. And that's unfortunate because that's not the way science works.
I have a question that is a total different direction. So you have written about a lot of topics, COVID, but many, many others. And so I was just wondering kind of which stories have been your favorite or what's your favorite thing to write about. Please don't tell me it's brushing your cat's teeth.
I'm not going to lie. I did love that piece, but it is not my favorite. Honestly, before the pandemic started, I didn't really consider myself much of a health writer, and I'm still not sure I necessarily do. It's not always a hard line between science coverage and health coverage. Of course, science has to inform health, and health informs the topics that scientists often find themselves delving into. But I've always really liked basic research. I like just sitting with a big pile of papers. I like thinking about ecology and evolution and animals. Humans are boring sometimes. I don't just want to write about humans and their problems. So a lot of my favorite pieces have just been about wow, what a bizarre occurrence in the natural world, or anything that sort of humbles the human experience. Humans love to fancy themselves unique or more evolved than other animals, whatever that means. It's certainly not true, or, that we're unique in certain aspects of our language or our cognition. But there's so much more impressive biology out there than what we have eked out or complemented or even warped with technology and artificial selection. I think my favorite topics just go beyond that. And also, I've really gotten a kick lately out of actually intersecting the two topics that have most dominated my journalistic career so far, which is kind of weird animal stuff and immunology and vaccinology. I'm really interested in animal vaccination right now and how that is affecting animal conservation.
So, Katie, there's a young Katie somewhere out there, maybe in college, who loves science and is thinking of doing what you're doing. What advice would you give them?
Oh, gosh. The first is you can listen to what I have to say, but don't take my word as gospel. Listen to lots of other people because there is no single path to doing what I do or doing what my colleagues do. The key is to just try it first, see if you like it, talk to a lot of different people, get their perspectives. And I don't know, I think so much of this job is just learning by doing. I had zero sense of what doing science was like until I started doing bench work in a lab, until I learned how to use a pipette, until I learned what it was to have a PCR fail over and over and over and over. It's exactly the same thing in this job. You got to learn by doing, got to learn by watching other people, and be incredibly humble. I think I am best at this job when I allow my mind to be changed, sometimes even over the course of a single piece. If someone tells me something that really surprises me or, shocks me, I try and pay attention to that. I will bold it. I will highlight it. I will ask them follow-up questions. And the next person I talk to, I'll ask, I heard something that surprised me. What do you think of this? Is this something that you would expect to surprise other people? What do you think of it? Because if it surprises me, there's a good chance it is something that is also unknown to one of my readers. And so, I don't know. I think that is one holdover from science that I really appreciate is still stuck in my brain when I do my work now.
Do you think that to be an effective science writer, you should have a science background?
I don't think it's a requirement. I think it can be really beneficial. I think it has been for me. But also, I think any person who is dedicated to the craft of journalism is at heart a little bit scientific. There is skepticism that is natural in this job. There is digging that is natural in this job. If you see inconsistencies, you want to explore them. All good journalists have those instincts. And I think if they take the time to really know the subjects that they're writing about, whether it's politics, culture, business, real estate, they will follow those instincts. And I think sometimes when they're writing about science, it will lead them to read papers, which they will learn to read over time. They will learn to think a little bit more like a scientist by talking to more people over time. I think it can really help to, take a course on Coursera about virology if you know you're going to be writing about that, to learn about like how FDA regulation works. But I don't think anyone needs explicitly like a degree in biology, or certainly not a PhD or a master's to do this job well. It just requires the same sort of commitment that you would put into any other piece of writing that you would be doing. Know the subject well.
Do you have any plans to write a book?
I do get this question a lot. I hope so someday. No immediate plans, but honestly, if I were to write a science-focused book someday, I think it would have something to do with immunology and infectious disease. I can't tell you what subset yet, but that would probably be what would interest me most.
Oh, not frogs.
Not, hey, maybe frog immunology. Who knows? I'll work the frogs in somehow.
I got a colleague who works on that right down the hall if you want to talk to her.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I would love to.
Frog immunology. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's very cool.
Have your parents come around to you not being an engineer or physician?
I think so. Yeah, it's very, I think, different from what they might have expected I would do initially, but I think I'm doing okay financially. That puts my mom's mind at ease. And I think she's glad to know that whenever she sends me a science article, she rarely sends me anything from The Atlantic. I will say that. She reads a lot of the other mainstream stuff that isn't always 100% accurate, but I will try to vet it for her. And so I'm glad I can do that sometimes. So I'm useful.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I'm pride worthy, but I'm at least useful.
I think you should be pride worthy in her mind.
Thank you.
Okay, Katherine Wu, The Atlantic Magazine. You can find that at theatlantic.com. Go subscribe and read her articles. Thank you, Katie, for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thanks, Katie.
Thank you so much.
Can we do just a few maybe one email each, and start to make some headway, because we haven't answered any in a long time. That's okay with Kathy and Brianne? Yes.
Mm-hmm, sure.
All right. Brianne, can you take the first one, please?
Sure. Ron writes, "Hi, TWiV team. I am in a discussion with a friend who insists that vaccines are designed to prevent infection. And I remember this issue as vaccines are designed not to prevent infection of a pathogen, but rather to minimize disease after an individual has been infected. In our discussion, my friend used polio vaccine as an example that prevented infection. So who better to ask than you all and of course, Vincent. My friend's point is, of course, that the COVID vaccine should not be called a vaccine because it doesn't prevent an individual from being infected, and that's why people get sick still, even after receiving the vaccine. Hopefully, you can help clear this up for both of us. Ron. Well, Ron, we just mentioned that a little bit, but I think that polio vaccine most certainly does not prevent vaccine. That's part of the reason why we've seen polio in some wastewater samples.
You said prevent vaccine. You meant prevent infection.
I meant prevent
Yes.
infection, of course.
Yes.
Yes. And I also agree that the person I would ask about this is Vincent. So,
Well, yeah, we did talk about this, that even some vaccines which are thought to be sterilizing, like the HPV, even the experts say, well, we actually don't have the evidence to say that it is 100% effective at preventing disease. Now, the polio vaccines do not prevent infection. In fact, an inactivated vaccine prevents paralysis, and after you get it, your intestines are still susceptible to infection. So you get infected, but you don't get paralyzed. The oral polio vaccines, for a period of time, will prevent infection, but once antibody in the levels in the gut decline, they don't. Same with the COVID vaccines. Once antibody levels decline, and probably other immune correlates as well, you get infected and you may get mild disease, but they prevent severe disease and illness. So to define a vaccine as preventing infection, you can't have your own definition. It's like RFK wants to define a placebo as either water or saline. No, you cannot have your own definition. I'm sorry. So he said, the vaccines haven't been placebo tested because it wasn't water or saline. So vaccines is a modified form of the pathogen that induces immunity but does not cause disease itself. Yeah.
So I have to say that one of the biggest things that I've learned in the pandemic is that I had not thought much before about what vaccines actually do. And if you had asked me before, I would have thought that, oh, yes, they prevent infection. You get a polio vaccine, fine, you're not going to get paralyzed. You get a flu vaccine, you're not going to get the flu. But obviously, my view of things has changed a lot, and now I understand that my understanding of vaccines and what they do was rather rudimentary, and that vaccines can prevent severe disease, but they don't prevent infection.
Yeah, I think that when I've had to try to think about some of this for students and in different ways, I've done some exercises in class and things like that, I've realized how much of it gets into talking about and thinking about probabilities and probability changes, and changing the probability of this type of outcome, potentially changing the probability of transmission, potentially changing the probability of this or probability of that. And people aren't very good at thinking about probabilities. And so trying to figure out ways to communicate this, that it's about probability changing, but also what the heck probability changing means, can be a bit of a challenge.
I have trouble with probabilities too. It's math.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But yeah, I agree, Kathy. We hadn't thought a lot about infection versus disease, although I look at my lectures and it is properly stated there. But so I have been teaching the right thing, at least.
I came up with a way to do an in-class model that gets at the probability thing, Vincent, if you ever want to play around with it in class.
Would love to. I would play around with it for myself.
Well, you kind of need a bunch of people.
Okay. We can do that. Kathy, can you take the next one?
Sure. Lisa writes, hello, TWiV gurus. I have forwarded slides from the most recent CDC One Health Partners webinar. Beginning on slide 19, the current known non-human species that have been naturally infected with SARS-CoV-2 are outlined. I thought you might be interested based on the discussion in episode 985. Thank you very much for all you do. And Lisa's a veterinarian in Oregon, where she reports the temperature was 41 Fahrenheit. So that's probably from a while ago. In fact, I do remember looking at the slide set way back when and looked at slide 19, where it has the animals naturally infected with SARS-CoV-2 as of January 16th, 2023. And it's got a large collection of them that's worth looking at. I pasted that image in here, but the whole slide set was pretty cool. So thanks for that.
A lot of animals, right?
Yes.
Wow, cool. So a couple of weeks ago, we did a TWiV at UPenn, and before the TWiV, there were 4 talks by Penn scientists, and one of them was an ecologist who was studying infections of white-tailed deer in particular. But he said that at the beginning of the pandemic, the UK was considering killing all house cats because it became clear that they were getting infected. Can you imagine?
No.
That they would, and they didn't even have enough data to say it was an issue, right? They would just, oh my God, it would be a revolt.
That would be a big fat no.
You couldn't do that as it was bad enough that people are staying home and not working, but to take their pets that they love, oh my gosh. They obviously called that off, but everyone was shocked because none of us knew that before. All right, the last email is from Jens. Dear TWiV team, I feel like Batman being summoned via a light in the sky. So, since you called, yes, we did. This is an old email. We called Jens a while ago. In TWiV 973, you replied to a letter by Joe who asked about the differences between species, strains, and variants. You answered that a variant is basically like you, Kathy, Dix, and me. That is incorrect, in particular regarding SARS-CoV-2, but also Ebola virus, etc. Variants are defined genetic lineages of a virus that have certain constellations of within the lineage fixed, i.e. selected for mutations, SARS-CoV-2 variants, alpha, beta, Omicron are such defined lineages, and each is represented by thousands, millions of individual viruses that have additional genetic changes that come and go. In short, you and I may be infected with Omicron, but that does not mean that you and I have the same virus. Once sequenced, the virus that infected us will have the necessary genetic makeup to make it SARS-CoV-2 and to assign it to a variant Omicron. But once the genomes are aligned, you may find many nucleotide differences nevertheless. Subvariants, therefore, are new lineages within a defined lineage that gained additional fixed mutations on top of the variant-defining trait. And once again, the sublineage is represented by thousands of viruses that are variable on the individual level but share a common genetic trait. To go back to you guys, all of you are isolates of human, and you may or may not belong to the same genetic lineage. Okay, so let me just pause. I don't know. Definitions are tough because we make them all up. But I thought, and others have agreed with me, that a variant is basically an isolate. Like if you isolate from Kathy and me and Brianne and SARS-CoV-2 and they have a genome sequence difference, they're variants. They are isolates too, but I think they're variants. I didn't know this business about defined genetic lineages. So to make it more complicated, Trevor Bedford said we should be naming all the Omicron subvariants variants and giving them, we should be up to psi now, he said, right? Something like that. So I don't know about this, Jens, but I'm willing to listen. I just thought it was an isolate. Okay, so
I was just going to say, I think one place where this gets tricky is that oftentimes we want to use things like the three of us as our examples, like whole organisms.
Yeah.
And there are a few more steps with the whole organism before we get individual changes. So if you thought about a few cells in my skin, they might have picked up individual mutations. So are those all isolates or variants of Brianne? I think it's sort of a question of
totally
what scale we're on.
So maybe you define your sequence as germ cell sequence, right?
Right.
Because that's what could pass on. That's an interesting question because every one of your cells has a slightly different sequence, right? So you're full of variants, Brianne.
Exactly. So kind of how much of it's just about the polymerase versus how much about it is in the germ cell and in selection and ability to go to a next generation. I think that makes it hard to compare organisms and unicellular things or viruses.
Right. All right, going on. In TWiV 979, you began discussing realms and megataxa in viruses and finally called me out in apparent desperation. Yes, we do. Thank you for responding. Given that yours is a podcast all about viruses, and given the seismic shift that has happened in recent years regarding our understanding of the virus sphere, maybe dedicate some time on an episode on this topic, going through and summarizing some crucial papers, as this is way too much for a reader's letter. All right, so Jens, who do you think we should have on to do this? I agree. We should have a whole episode devoted to realms and megataxa. So it sounds like it would be a fascinating episode. But he gives some references here. One paper, Global Organization and Proposed Megataxonomy of the Virus World by Kunin et al. Is the most important of them, as it lays the groundwork for what are now the ICT-accepted realms. By the way, when I go to meetings and people talk about these, Jens, I hear all kinds of sighs and groans because they don't like it. So you guys may have all agreed in this room somewhere, but a lot of people don't like it. I'm not saying anything. What do we say? It's out of my realm.
Agnostic.
It's out of my lane. Later, an additional 2 were added: adenoviria and riboziviria. Eugene's paper also discusses the polyphyly of viruses. The meat of the paper, that is the framework for the current virus megataxonomy, is laid out in Figure 11. Then another paper, viruses defined by the position of the virus sphere within the replicator space, was the development of the now accepted ICTV definition of virus, as well indirectly the definition of viroid, satellite nucleic acid, and viriform. This paper also defines the terms virosphere and its subdivisions into orthovirosphere and perivirosphere. And if you haven't yet heard the term viriform, he gives a paper for that. Viriform is a new category of classifiable virus-derived genetic elements by myself, and Eugene as a primer. Brianne and Kathy, have you heard of viriforms?
No.
I have not. So we need to have someone come here. Maybe Kunin and Jens together. Wouldn't that be funny? Or someone else. We'll talk about it.
Just as an aside, I think that pronunciation, at least in the United States, should be primer.
Really?
Yes.
Not primer? Yes. Oh, no, because it's a primer, yes. When I saw the word, I said, what's the right way to say it? And I'm thinking of oligonucleotides. Primer, right. Yes. Okay, primer, you're right. As candy for dessert, I would recommend another paper, The Global Virome, How Much Diversity and How Many Independent Origins, again by Eugene et al., which discusses the questions, how many realms there really may be. The term realm was chosen instead of domain because the genetic variability, even within one virus clade that now is a realm, is much higher than in the entire organismal tree of life, and people thought that domain would be misleading. And correct, viruses do not fit into the tree of life. Remember TWiV 357 with me, which was called Mistletoe on the Tree of Life. And then a paper, Evolving Perspective on the Origin and Diversification of Cellular Life in the Virosphere by Anja Sprang et al. You have also overlooked the massive expansion of prokaryotic RNA viruses, starting with this paper, Expansion of Known Single-Stranded RNA phage Genomes from Tens to Over 1,000 by Julie Callanan et al., leading to levivirusetes expanding and restructuring the taxonomy of bacteria infecting single-stranded RNA viruses, also by Julie et al., and most recently, the fantastic predecessor paper of the one you discussed in the episode, Expansion of the Global RNA Virome Reveals Diverse Clades of Bacteriophages by Uri Neri et al., which increased that clade to tens of thousands. If interested in general RNA virus diversity, the RNA virus sphere, How Big and Diverse Is It by Guillermo Dominguez Huerta might be great fun on top of that. Several of the papers above also address all kinds of cute things, such as cute in Jens's sense of cute retroviroids, satellites, virophages, all kinds of posons, etc., to assimilate all this vast new knowledge that has been accumulated recently by the various players in the field and their many colleagues. Together, this should be sufficient for a short discussion to frame what virology has become. Smiley face. And if you guys need a quick re-review on how the ICTV works again and on all the ranks and the new binomial species nomenclature, et cetera. There's a great summary article about to be published in PLOS Biology, written by the ICTV Executive Committee and additional colleagues. Cheers, Jens. P.S. I always say aubergine, but eggplant is a wonderful example why viruses don't have to be renamed just because the name label might be misleading or incorrect. No eggs in eggplant, and yet Americans seem to do just fine with the term. That's a good point, right?
Yeah.
No egg in eggplant. Maybe that should be the title of today's, well, another episode. Hold on. I can't type and speak at the same time.
The article that he mentioned was to be published February 13th in PLOS Biology, so it probably is already out there. I'm kind of looking for it now.
Yeah,
I can't talk and type at the same time either.
These emails have been here a long time because we have had distractions. And we have many more. In fact, the next one is also from Jens. But he says in the next one, it's funny, a.k.a. Bruce Wayne. What does that mean?
Batman.
Oh, okay. Well, what is that, the actor?
No, it's his real name.
His real persona, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, like Clark Kent and Superman.
See, I really don't know much virology nor much else, I suppose. At least not classification. But let's do some picks of the week. Brienne, what do you have for us today?
So I have a story that I learned about while I was in South Africa. One of the places that we visit when I go is the Maropeng Caves, where we learned about some of the work that was done there, particularly the findings of the early hominid remains from Homo naledi. And so I have both a link to just sort of the general information about these caves and what's there, and an article, strangely enough, from the Atlantic about the discovery of Homo naledi and sort of the story behind the finding Homo naledi, which I think is absolutely fascinating. There were some samples that were found, and the scientists then had to put up a Facebook ad to get some people with paleontology expertise. And there were a whole bunch of constraints on the people because they needed to be able to go into these very small, tight caves. And so it ended up being an entire team of women paleontologists, because they were the only ones who were small enough to fit into the caves and go and get some of these samples. So there's this really interesting team of these 6 women paleontologists who went into the cave, discovered all of these samples. There's some videos that you can find elsewhere online, though if you are claustrophobic, I would not recommend watching them. Who then went and found all of these Homo naledi samples. And so I think the story is just a really fascinating story. I think there's a lot of great stuff that we can learn. And I'm excited about this, team of women scientists who did this work.
Cool.
When there used to be battleships made of wood, right, with cannons in the side, the Brits had young kids do the cannons because the ceiling was low, and they're the only ones that could run up and down and load the cannons, because an adult would have to be bent over and it wasn't efficient. And so lots of kids got killed because the boats were getting shelled from both sides. But I learned that in San Diego. There's a boat there, one of these cannon-laden boats, and the guide told us that, yeah, they were all young kids. And so there was a lot of mortality in that age at that time because of that. Kind of skewed the life expectancy for a while.
Sure.
Kathy, what do you have for us?
I picked something that relates to a documentary that I saw here in Ann Arbor several months ago called Being Mary Tyler Moore. And so I included a link to the trailer. The full movie is on HBO Max, so I realized that there will be a lot of people who can't access it, but maybe you'll have an opportunity to see it in the way that I did, where we saw it as a film showing with 2 scientists involved in diabetes, and also Mary Tyler Moore's husband, who's a physician. And so it has a lot of cool things for those of us for whom Mary Tyler Moore was a hero or heroine in that, she was in one of her TV shows, she was a single woman with a career. And so there's that aspect to it. But she also did work on for JDRF, the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation. She discovered that she had type 1 diabetes when she was 33, and other travails that she had in her life. But it was just really a nice mix of clips from her shows, humor, some serious stuff, and just a really nice documentary. So if you have a chance to see that, I recommend it.
Cool. JDRF. My pick is an article in The Atlantic. I'm perusing my online subscription, and I came across this cool article. It's entitled "Google Isn't Grad School" by Arthur C. Brooks. Having so much information at our fingertips is useful but seductive, easily fooling us into thinking we know more than we do. You get the picture, right? It's all about people thinking they could be experts just by a few Google searches. And it's an interesting article. I want to quote one part here. And he's saying, it's great to want to learn things. Learning about novel ideas is a thrill. And indeed, many researchers believe that interest itself is a positive emotion, a source of pleasure rooted in the evolutionary imperative to learn new things. I mean, look at us here on TWiV. We get excited to learn new things, right? We're genuinely excited. We're not doing it to amuse you. We're excited about. We're doing it to teach you. Cruising the web in search of interesting things is great fun, but beware your own susceptibility to the illusion of explanatory depth. If you think you understand something technical and complicated, after cursory exposure, you might be able to put the knowledge to good use in your life, but you almost certainly don't understand it well enough to hold forth on the topic. Hold forth. That means talking about vaccines when you don't know anything about them. That's holding forth on a subject. But good article. And he also goes into academia. So he's an academician. He's a professor somewhere. And he talks about how, his colleague, is it this article or is it another one? I can't remember. Anyway, it's really good. Check it out. We also have, so The Atlantic's a good, do I call it a magazine? Is that the proper name? Magazine?
I call it a magazine, but I also only read the website, so I can see the confusion.
No, it's still a magazine, I guess. We have to redefine our words, just like Jens would say. We're making Viri forms or whatever it was.
If there are no eggs in eggplant, it's okay if there's no paper in my magazine.
Well, he also said years ago on TWiV that a lot of people complain when you have a genome sequence and then you say, we're going to classify this virus. He said, you don't have the virus. Some people think you need to have a virus isolate to clarify. He said, well, we don't have any isolates of T-Rex, and still we classify T-Rex as a dinosaur in a certain family. So, he's asking humans to be consistent. All right, I just pulled out a couple of listener picks because we have a whole bunch of these. One is from John. After hearing your musings on the root cause of the world's problems in Epitope 1013, I came across this interesting article that cites Blaise Pascal, who once wrote, all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room. A 2014 study lends support to this idea. It's an article in theworld.org, and it says, a new study found people are terrible at sitting alone with their thoughts. How about you? And the money quote from the article with a link to the study in Science. A recent study in the journal Science found that many people choose to self-administer an electrical shock rather than sit quietly in a room alone with their thoughts. Oh, my God. Oh, my gosh. I have no problem. And I bet Kathy and Brianne have no problem sitting alone with their thoughts.
No problem.
Nope,
No problem.
With plenty to think about. I've never I tell people, man, if you can't think of stuff to think about, but most people look at their phones, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then we have Alan. That's from John. and the next one is Alan, who writes, not Alan Dove. Hello, TWiV team. Here's a very on-topic and excellent video from last year that not only provides a great introduction to viruses for non-scientists, but also covers the geobiochemical effects of viruses in the ocean, which was featured in TWiV 1011, which was up in Quebec City. It's a SciShow epitope. Let's see if I could get the title without it playing. What if all viruses vanished? Oh, yes, that's what we talked about in Quebec. I asked them, what if all the viruses vanished? When did they publish this? A year ago. I didn't take my question from this. SciShow. Okay. As always with SciShow videos, all the material, research papers, and articles are linked in the show notes. Looking forward to TWiV 1012. All the best, Alan. P.S. Count me among the 50% plus non-scientists who listen to TWiV on the regular. My TWiV Saves Lives research paper that you enjoyed was a way of saying thank you for all your education efforts. Thank you, Alan. All right, that'll do it for TWiV 1023. You can find the show notes at microbe.tv/TWiV. You can send your questions, comments, and pics to TWiV at microbe.tv. You can support us. If you'd like to, you can, or you may. We depend on your financial support to do these, and you can find at microbe.tv/contribute a couple of ways for you to do that. Kathy Spindler is at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Thank you, Kathy.
Thanks. This is a lot of fun.
Brianne Barker's at Drew University, BioProf Barker on Twitter. Thanks, Brianne.
Thanks. I learned a lot.
I'm Vincent Racaniello. You can find me at virology.ws. I'd like to thank the American Society for Virology and the American Society for Microbiology for their support of TWiV, Ronald Jenkins for the music, and Jolene for the timestamps. You've been listening to This Week in Virology. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back next week. Another TWiV is viral.